Hey YouTube, and hey Bossman. This is a response to Bossman103's video, Why God? First of all, I'm back. I'm feeling much better now, and I would have been back to make these videos much sooner, but I was traveling over the Thanksgiving holiday season and simply couldn't get near a webcam long enough to do this. I barely had enough time to stay caught up on my work. Note, for those who disapprove of the American holiday of Thanksgiving, let me say unequivocally, yes, it's a racist holiday that grossly misrepresents history, but I take time to correct any unhistorical claims made in my presence regarding the holiday, and I am just a sucker for a good stuffing, which for my non-American viewers is the delicious dressing made from breadcrumbs, celery, pork sausage, and a variety of other ingredients so important to the traditional American Thanksgiving meal. Now to business. I'm sorry if I've misunderstood your point, Bossman, about Miller and Hoyt. I'm not so sure that I have understood it, as I will explain in a moment, but certainly I wish to understand, and I will sincerely apologize if I can be shown that I did not. I would offer a contingent apology now, but I have always found that contingent apologies sound insincere, mostly because they usually are. You talk about Dawkins and company attacking religion as a whole, rather than joining forces, as it were, with the likes of Miller and Hoyt to combat the common foes like creationism and, I would assume, extremism in general. For my part, let me say that I am willing to do that when the occasion arises, but I share Dawkins' perspective that religion itself is harmful and ought to be put aside. I've touched on this point in previous videos in our dialogue, so I'll be brief here. Essentially that, as long as these religions exist, splinter groups of harmful extremists will inevitably form. Schisms of the Christian faith were killing one another within a couple centuries of Christ's death, followers of Muhammad just as quickly. And generally, it is the prerogative of any individual, including members of the New Atheist movement, to choose for themselves which topics deserve their attention, and our criticism of those choices, even when legitimate, have nothing to do with the truth or falsity of their claims. And let me also point out that personally, I have no responsibility to answer for Dawkins or anyone else's arguments, or who they choose to argue with, or what they choose to criticize. I'm here to argue for my position, which in many respects happens to agree with that of Dawkins and Dennett and Harris and Hitchens and so on. Now, you mentioned my comments about holy books being barbarous when read cover to cover, and you talk about the necessity of interpretation and the dangers of literalism. Well, when I was a Christian, I would certainly have agreed with you enthusiastically. Certainly, even today, I think theology at its most intelligent is very interpretive and almost never literal. However, considering the large tendency for such large numbers of people to choose literalism, it seems a careless God to have left such passages and instructions in his holy book as would require such interpretation to make them anything but barbarism. It would be like teaching someone to emulate Machiavelli by studying The Prince without making reference to Machiavelli's long list of pro-democratic literature, his imprisonment for populist ideals, and various other bits of evidence that The Prince was meant to be taken facetiously, which is exactly what happens with our modern understanding of Machiavelli. It is not Machiavelli's fault that people only remember him for The Prince, but then again, Machiavelli was not an omniscient deity. I would expect a god to do better. Also you add, I quote, "You can't just say that's barbarous, and that's the end of the argument," end of quote. I certainly didn't intend for that to be taken as my ending the argument, and if I said as much, I do apologize. I expect that every claim that I make is subject to rebuttal by anyone who has a different view, and I'm perfectly open to listen to those rebuttals. Now to your main point. What makes it more or less likely to be a creative entity? Well, for me that's Occam's razor. Intelligence or creativity, as we understand it, are incredibly burdensome and unnecessary attributes to assign to the inciting force of our universe. And I'd like to say, Bossman, I realize that you aren't arguing for a guy with a white beard on a cloud, and I would hope that you would do me the credit of not assuming that I'm only offering arguments to that obvious straw man. I'm more than willing to address your claims and your vision of God on your own terms. You say, and again I quote, "I don't believe that non-life brought about life," end of quote. And you make an argument that is generally very similar to the issue of abiogenesis as it is discussed by proponents of intelligent design. I must say, I don't think Ken Miller would approve. I feel sure he would join me in pointing out that the initiating cause of life need not have been alive itself. To simply put God did it on what is, I admit, a mystery, we don't know exactly what caused the start of life, the start of things which could reproduce and evolve, but we do have speculations, and it's important to realize that if our speculations are correct, it's perfectly understandable that no physical evidence remains. We would not expect these things to be fossilized. In fact, there's a huge gap between where we know what we know must have been like when life first started and what we can observe in the fossil record. You talk about life starting with electricity and point out that it is part of the natural order of things. The first thing I would point out is that the idea of life starting with a lightning strike or with electricity is not the current vogue of biological theory. You also talk about the planet is alive in a sort of pantheistic sense. Like your discussion of electricity being part of the natural order, I think this blurs the distinction between life and non-life. I think any biologist would agree that lightning is not an organic phenomenon. This brings to mind a criticism Richard Dawkins offers in his book, The Greatest Show on Earth, great book by the way, of phylogeny, as biologists have established it today. By creating clear delineations of species and subspecies, they have not done justice to the continuous nature of evolving life, and the transitional forms from parent species to emerging species cannot be truly represented or said to cross a clearly marked line. And this has largely contributed to the public's misunderstanding of evolution. Likewise, the distinction between the organic and the inorganic is more subtle than we are brought up to realize. What we call life could well have come from something that we would now call non-life, if you will permit the stipulation that in the transition a gray area exists. This really should not be difficult, since we do not acknowledge the virus to be life, and yet there's clearly something different between a virus and non-reproducing objects like rocks and other molecules. I don't know that there is a necessity for non-life to have created life, but since we are here to discuss it, the anthropic principle tells us we have no business being surprised to find that it's happened. I really don't think you're doing justice to the views of Ken Miller and others you seek to point out as champions. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. Thanks for listening.